Joseph was a young man with big dreams. He was the 11th son of Jacob and the favorite of his father. Because of this, Jacob gave Joseph a beautiful, colorful coat, making his brothers jealous. But Joseph wasn't just special because of his coat. He had a gift for dreaming, and his dreams always carried deep meanings. One day, Joseph had a dream that he eagerly shared with his brothers.
We were all binding sheaves of grain out in the field.
He said,
Suddenly, my sheaf stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it.
His brothers were furious.
Do you think you will rule over us?
They asked. Their anger grew when Joseph had another dream. This time, he dreamt that the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to him. When Joseph told his father, even Jacob was puzzled.
What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I, and your brothers, actually come and bow down to you?
Although Jacob was confused, he pondered Joseph's words in his heart. But for his brothers, these dreams were too much. Their envy turned into hatred, and they started plotting against him. One day, when Joseph was sent by his father to check on his brothers who were grazing their flocks, they saw him coming from a distance.
Here comes that dreamer.
They sneered.
Let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a wild animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams.
But Reuben, the oldest brother, didn't want Joseph to die. He suggested they throw him into the cistern without harming him, planning to rescue him later. So when Joseph arrived, they stripped him of his colorful coat and threw him into an empty cistern. As they sat down to eat, a caravan of Ishmaelites approached. Judah, another brother, had an idea.
What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites instead.
The brothers agreed, and they sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. The Ishmaelites took Joseph to Egypt, far away from his family and the dreams he had once shared. Joseph's life in Egypt began as a slave, but he remained faithful to God. He was sold to Potiphar, a wealthy Egyptian, and soon earned Potiphar's trust, becoming the overseer of his household. Everything Joseph did prospered because God was with him. However, trouble soon followed. Potiphar's wife noticed Joseph's good looks and tried to seduce him, but Joseph refused, saying,
How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?
Angered by his rejection, she falsely accused him of trying to harm her. Potiphar believed his wife and had Joseph thrown into prison. Even in prison, Joseph remained faithful and hardworking. The prison warden noticed this and put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. God continued to bless Joseph, and soon, he was running the prison. One day, 2 of Pharaoh's officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, were thrown into the same prison. They both had troubling dreams one night and were upset because they had no one to interpret them. Joseph noticed their distress and said,
Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams.
The cupbearer went first.
In my dream, I saw a vine with 3 branches. As it budded, its blossoms came out, and the clusters ripened into grapes. I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand.
Joseph replied,
The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your position as cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison.
The chief baker was eager to share his dream, hoping for good news.
In my dream, I had 3 baskets of bread on my head. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket.
Joseph's interpretation was not as favorable.
The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh.
3 days later, everything happened just as Joseph had said. The cupbearer was restored to his position, and the baker was executed. However, the cupbearer forgot about Joseph and did not mention him to Pharaoh. 2 years passed, and Joseph remained in prison, forgotten by the cupbearer. But one night, Pharaoh had 2 troubling dreams that no one in his court could interpret. In his first dream, 7 fat cows were eating by the Nile River when 7 thin, ugly cows came out of the river and ate the fat cows. In his second dream, 7 healthy ears of grain were growing on a single stalk, but then 7 thin, scorched ears of grain sprouted and swallowed up the healthy ones. Pharaoh was disturbed and called for all the wise men and magicians of Egypt, but none could explain the dreams. It was then that the cupbearer remembered Joseph. He told Pharaoh about the young Hebrew in prison who had accurately interpreted his and the baker's dreams. Pharaoh immediately sent for Joseph. When Joseph was brought before him, Pharaoh said,
I have had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said that you can understand dreams.
Joseph humbly replied,
I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires.
Pharaoh recounted his dreams, and Joseph, with God's guidance, interpreted them.
The 2 dreams are one and the same.
Joseph explained.
The 7 fat cows and the 7 healthy ears of grain represent 7 years of great abundance in Egypt. But the 7 thin cows and the 7 scorched ears of grain represent 7 years of severe famine that will follow. The famine will be so devastating that the years of plenty will be forgotten.
Joseph then advised Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning man to oversee the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. This man should store up food in the cities to prepare for the 7 years of famine. Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph's wisdom that he appointed him as second in command over all of Egypt. Joseph was given a royal ring, fine clothes, and the authority to act on Pharaoh's behalf. Joseph, who had once been a slave and a prisoner, was now the most powerful man in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. The 7 years of abundance came just as Joseph had predicted. During this time, Joseph stored up vast amounts of grain in Egypt. When the 7 years of famine arrived, the people of Egypt and the surrounding nations came to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe everywhere. In Canaan, Joseph's family was also affected by the famine. Jacob sent his 10 older sons to Egypt to buy grain, keeping Benjamin, his youngest and Joseph's full brother, at home. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt, they bowed down before him, not recognizing him as their long-lost brother. Joseph recognized them immediately, but he did not reveal his identity. Instead, he tested them to see if they had changed. He accused them of being spies and put them in prison for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Joseph released them but kept Simeon as a hostage, demanding that they bring Benjamin to prove their innocence. The brothers returned home and told their father everything. Jacob was heartbroken but eventually agreed to let Benjamin go. When the brothers returned to Egypt with Benjamin, Joseph could no longer hold back his emotions. He revealed his true identity to them, saying,
I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But do not be distressed or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you.
Joseph's brothers were terrified, thinking he would seek revenge. But Joseph reassured them.
You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives.
Joseph forgave his brothers and invited his entire family to live in Egypt, where they would be safe from the famine. Jacob and all his sons, along with their families, moved to Egypt, and Joseph provided for them. When Jacob arrived in Egypt, Joseph went out to meet him. It had been years since they had seen each other, and the reunion was filled with tears of joy. Jacob embraced Joseph, saying,
Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive.
Joseph brought his father to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh before settling in the land of Goshen, where they lived in peace and prosperity. Jacob lived for 17 more years in Egypt before passing away at the age of 147. Before he died, he blessed each of his sons, giving them his final words and prophecies about their future. Jacob was mourned by his family and by all of Egypt. Joseph, along with his brothers, carried Jacob's body back to Canaan, where he was buried in the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham, Isaac, and their wives were buried. After Jacob's death, Joseph's brothers feared that he might still hold a grudge against them. They came to him, bowing down and offering to be his slaves. But Joseph said to them,
Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.
And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph lived in Egypt for many more years, seeing his children and grandchildren grow. He lived to be 110 years old. As he neared the end of his life, Joseph gathered his family around him and made them promise that when God delivered them from Egypt, they would carry his bones back to the land of Canaan. Joseph died peacefully, confident that God's promises to his family would be fulfilled. Joseph's body was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt, but his legacy lived on. His story of perseverance, faith, and forgiveness became a testament to the power of trusting in God's plan, even in the face of great adversity. Joseph's story teaches us the power of faith, perseverance, and forgiveness. Despite the hardships he faced, Joseph remained faithful to God and was eventually rewarded. His ability to forgive those who wronged him allowed for healing and reconciliation. When we face challenges in life, we should remember that God has a plan, and with faith, we can overcome adversity and find peace through forgiveness. His legacy reminds us that true leadership is rooted in compassion, and that God's timing is always perfect. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends and family. Subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories and lessons that can guide you in your daily life. Leave a comment below on how you practice forgiveness in your own life, and let's start a conversation about the power of faith, love, and legacy.